Welcome to the next episode of Great War Story. I've called this one simply Combat Engineers. As you know, it always follows somehow or other some of my family history, and this is no exception. And in this case, we're back to 2nd Lieutenant William Francis. He's the one who got me interested in the battle on the Crozat Canal. He died with the 11th Fusiliers defending the Crozat Canal on March 23rd, 1918. But before he ended up in that battle, he had some time with the Royal Engineers. Now, in August of 1917, he had finally qualified as a junior officer. He had been training in England, he had become a 2nd lieutenant, and he was sent out to France, and he was posted to join the 12th Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers City of London Regiment. Now, I can't help thinking in this case of the movie Journey's End. Well, I think it was a play originally. And I'll give away some of the plot if you haven't seen it already. You have these old grizzled officers who have been in it for quite a while, and this young kid, fresh out of England with no combat experience, but a bit of a fire eater, filled with all the brave things he's going to do. And the older officers are trying to teach him some wisdom and keep him alive. And also, kind of interesting for me, given the way that William Francis, my great-uncle, was killed, the whole climax of the movie is the doom of the impending build-up of the German spring offensive, and they are in frontline trenches, and basically the whole thing ends with the German bombardment, and, well, it's kind of implied that they all die at the end. So I can't help wondering if that's how the officers felt when my great-uncle turned up. This green officer, he had no combat experience, he was 19 years old. Some of the other officers could have been 19, 20, 21, but they had started out as privates, had experienced what it was like, and in fact they reckon about the most dangerous job you could have if you're in the front line was a junior officer. They died at much greater rates than senior officers or, common enlisted men. So I can't help wondering how the other men felt about this fresh green lieutenant who just arrived in France without any combat experience of any kind. And so in September of 1917, just a month later, they were asked to send a platoon and one officer on attachment to join the 104th Field Company of the Royal Engineers. So guess who they sent? Yes, they sent this fresh green officer. Now there's two ways you could look at it. One was an act of mercy. They were trying to keep him alive, give him a bit more time away from the front line to gain a bit of experience and learn some valuable lessons. Or the other possibility is they didn't trust him and wanted to push him aside and make him somebody else's problem. Either way, I don't know. Now, there's a lot more than 25 guys here. 25 men would be a platoon strength. And yes, that one officer was indeed William Francis, my grandmother's brother. And I found this YouTube clip of this guy who dresses up in various different military uniforms and, shows you what it was like and tries his best to be true to life. And in this case, he was dressing up as a sapper in the 5th Field Company Royal Engineers, which would have been very much like the uniform of the engineers my great-uncle was hanging around with. If you like the sound of that, he's called Rifleman Moore. He's got 15,500 subscribers, so he's doing pretty well. Also of interest for me, you can see on his right sleeve there are these reverse chevrons. Those are showing years of service. Any man with them on his sleeve, that many, has been in the war since 1914. Just like my New Zealand grandfather who started out, he signed up in August of 1914 in New Zealand. He would have been entitled to have that on his right sleeve. And on the guy's left sleeve, over on the rightmost picture, you can see there's this single gold line just below his corporal stripes. That is a wound stripe. Again, my New Zealand grandfather had one of those and was entitled after his second nasty facial wound in 1918 to a second one of those. And it's really rather nice using these trench maps from the Scottish National Library and trying to match them up with what you see in the war diary. So in September of 1917, when he joined them, it says that they were at a camp at Littlewood Camp, half a mile south of Ytre. Most people have heard of Ypres, but not Ytre. And so I was able to find that on a map. And I googled all around trying to find what is this Littlewood camp. No luck. But as soon as I went to the trench map, you can see just south of Ypres is a place called Littlewood. So those two things in conjunction, the war diaries plus the trench maps, can sometimes be absolutely invaluable. And they mentioned that the CRE, the commander of the Royal Engineers, visited the camp. And I think at this time, the commander of the Royal Engineers was Sir Reginald Ulick Henry Buckland. I don't really mention him for any reason other than this awesome name. So many of these upper crust aristocratic English officers have these awesome long-barreled names. Sir Reginald Ulick Henry Buckland. Now, where exactly was Ypres? Now, on this trench map up there, you see all the red stuff like a fungus growing all over it up on the right? Those are the German trenches. So you can see they were about, maybe about 10 miles, 10 to 12, something in that kind of ballpark, away from the front line, close enough to come up and do duties, but far enough back to be reasonably safe from most German artillery. And over on the right, I gave you a wider context of where we're looking here. They are southwest of Cambrai. Now, if you know your history of World War I, you'll know if we're talking about September, October of 1917, this is the build-up to the Battle of Cambrai. There's big action in the making, and that was in fact the first time they really used tanks in the right way, mass deployment. This episode is not about that, but I figured I couldn't really mention Cambrai without taking note of it. Now, let's get back to what they were doing. So, this platoon from the 12th Battalion, Royal Fusiliers, along with my great-uncle, was allotted to number 3 section for work. October the 2nd, number 3 section was sent to the Royal Engineers HQ at Cooker's Quarry, north of St Quentin, to start work on increasing deep dugout accommodation. Exciting stuff, digging holes in the ground. October the 6th, changed jobs, started work on deep dugout for garrison of Dragoon Post. Now, I haven't yet found Cooker's Quarry, but I did manage to find Dragoon Post, and you can very much see here why they really needed deep dugouts there. That is the British front line, and you can see just 3 boxes across to the right, all those red lines, that's the German front line. Each one of the boxes on this scale map is about 1,000 yards, so they're not right on top of each other, but 3,000 yards is, well, it's within machine gun range, shall we say. And it's always lovely to compare the Google Maps with the old trench maps and see how much you can match up. And you can see just next to Dragoon Post, there's this rectangular forest, and it's still there. Red wood down on the Google Maps down the bottom. Somerville Wood is this sort of slightly scraggly, long, thin wood just a little bit to the right of Dragoon Post. And some of these other places will feature later in this episode, so worth paying attention to. You can see there's 11 trees. We will definitely mention that, and square copse. They will feature heavily. I think Bell Copse gets a brief mention. Now, on the map above, it doesn't mention Watling Street, but that street that's going up through Victoria Crossroads, that is Watling Street on the trench maps. Now, Watling Street, if you know your English history, was actually one of the Roman roads that the Romans built through, and is quite an important street name in English history, and they had borrowed that name to, well, for what's not, frankly, much more than a small little farm road, and called it Watling Street on their maps. Now, one thing that confused me initially, and I've marked out where Dragoon Post, where they were working, was exactly on the modern Google map. Now, the thing that confused me, and I've fixed up here, initially I thought, why can't I get these two maps to match up? Because I assumed that that road coming from the top of the map, running slightly southeast, was this major yellow road. It only dawned on me fairly recently that actually that's a brand new motorway, and it wasn't there. It's the road that runs by 11 trees that is the one that you're supposed to line up, and you should just ignore that road because that runs directly through what was once the German front line, and it simply wasn't there in 1917. And then, well, they got a few more infantry battalions sending them working parties. So the 12th Battalion Royal Fusiliers had sent a platoon, and on September the 26th, 3 more platoons turn up. The 8th Buffs has to send a platoon, the 1st Royal Fusiliers and the 3rd Rifle Brigade, and they go to sections 1, 2 and 4. I already mentioned that William Francis was with section 3. And then more exciting stuff. October the 1st, number 3 section, to start work on increasing deep dugout accommodation at, now the handwriting here was a bit hard to read, I think it was probably RF, Rifle Battalion HQ at Cooker's Quarry. October the 4th, number 3 section started work on deep dugouts at Cooker's Quarry, digging holes in the ground. October the 6th, number 3 section started work on deep dugout for garrison of Dragoon Post, and you can see it gave you the exact map coordinates, and the officer commanding went round work of forward section. And then when they were based at Milieu Copse, which was again quite far back from the front line, October the 8th, number 3 section started work on deep dugout at number 6 post. Officer commanding went around work on number 3 section on the line, dugouts at number 1 and number 6 post hanging fire owing to infantry parties not turning up. Well, that looks a lot like that would have been the 12th Fusiliers with my great-uncle. Was there some miscommunication? They were supposed to be there to help digging and they didn't show up? You can bet that the commanding officer was not very impressed, and I looked around on the New Zealand National Army Museum website because I get a lot of good photos from there, and I was looking for an officer who was looking unimpressed and grumpy as if he was turning up to inspect what was going on. And there it is, officer commanding around work of number 3 section in the line. Although when you see the rest of that photo, he doesn't look quite so grumpy anymore, because you can see he's actually arm in arm with another fellow officer, and I really wonder what the story behind that photo is. Then, October the 15th, number 4 section relieved number 3 section in forward billets and took over work in right subsection. Now, if this was all that was going on, it wouldn't make a very good and exciting episode, but there's some interesting things coming, so just hang fire. So, October 25th, recreational training, a game of soccer. Number 2 section beat number 3 2-1. Ah dear, William Francis's platoon was with number 3 section, so I guess they didn't do so well there. Officers and batmen, officers and their servants, beat attached infantry 6-0. So I guess you could say that the 12th Fusiliers and my great-uncle weren't that great at playing soccer. Now this is another photo from the New Zealand National Army Museum. It comes from somewhere in Egypt. And that goalpost looks way too big. But really, what a great photo. Especially, look at that guy in the middle. He's a giant. And those excellent shorts they're all wearing. I just love that photo. I needed an excuse to use it somewhere. And then, well, what do you do when you're with the Royal Engineers? As I said, you dig holes in the ground. Now that photo on the top left, given the trees in the background, I'm pretty confident that would have been New Zealanders training back in New Zealand. That looks very familiar to me as the kind of tree line you'd see next to many a farm in New Zealand. So I suspect those are New Zealanders training in their home country before going to war. The photo on the right, however, is near Armentières, and he's not looking terribly excited because, well, what's he been doing? He's been stuffing sandbags. And they had these special paddles that were used to compress the dirt in the sandbags. You can imagine loose dirt is not going to hold off bullets and shells nearly as well as packed dirt. So that's what he's doing. But again, not very exciting. Digging holes in the ground, pickaxes and spades and shovels. Well, I guess that's the work of World War I, isn't it? But occasionally the Royal Engineers would get to do something a little bit more exciting. If you've watched my episodes on the slaughter on the Crozet Canal, you'll have read some stuff about the Germans building pontoon bridges. So I guess building bridges is a little bit more exciting for the engineers than digging holes in the ground. And I guess bridges give you a nice place to hang around. This was a bridge built by the New Zealanders, although I think the soldiers on the bridge are not actually New Zealanders. They're just British troops enjoying the hard work of the New Zealand engineers. But have you met many engineers? Digging holes in the ground and building bridges is not really going to excite them that much. The engineers I know, especially when they were young, like the engineering school at my university when I was an undergraduate, they always said they had the wildest parties, and I actually do vividly recall being on campus the morning after one of their on-campus parties, and they were hosing out the vomit from their party. The engineering parties were infamous as being the most wild and, well, disgusting parties that any of the university departments had. And this photo, frankly, is a better characterization of how I imagine engineers to be. I mean, they're all New Zealanders. You can see there's a guy in the middle with a German cap on, but they're just goofing off and being stupid. I don't know, is that guy playing a banjo or something? And the guy on the right looks like he's got a German pistol of some description. Anyway, they're just goofing around and being stupid. Engineers, frankly, remind me much more of this character in the Muppets. I don't even know what his name is. The bomb guy. That's how I found that moving one. And this picture I started the episode with of this New Zealander pretending to whack an unexploded German shell. They want to make things go boom. So if an engineering company could come up with some plan to get the approval of the higher-ups to let them go and blow stuff up, that's what would ring their bell. And here's another example of it. This was another photo I found while I was looking for nice images for this episode from the National Army Museum. It's from Gallipoli, but again, it demonstrates the kind of thing engineers will do if you give them a chance. And the caption next to this photo reads, "Making life difficult for the Turk, a very rare, small, homemade trench mortar in a well-sandbagged position at the apex on Gallipoli, post-August 1915. The soldier on the left looks to have a bomb in his hands ready to drop down the barrel. Let them make a homemade mortar if they're given a chance. Make things go boom." That's what they want to do. Now, what better way to make things go boom than improvised cannons or mortars? And there are these devices called fougasses. That's how I'm pretty sure to pronounce it, but if I'm wrong, well, you can correct me in the comments, I guess. Now, if you go Googling and reading all the Wikipedia articles and those general stuff on fougasses, the most common place you'll find pictures and images and articles on the rest will actually be describing their use on Malta from, well, at least the 1700s onwards. It's basically a stone-throwing improvised shotgun. You put a big charge in the bottom of a hole, fill it with shrapnel, in this case small rocks, let off the charge underneath, and kaboom, a huge shower of rocks will hit enemy ships coming too close to the coast or something along those lines. The second most common thing you'll find as you're researching fougasses will actually be for the defence of Britain when they were getting ready for a Nazi invasion in World War II. And they developed these, well, they're basically napalm fougasses or petrol fougasses. Effectively, you dig the same thing in, you put a charge on the bottom of a barrel of fuel that lights up when you let the explosives off, and you get this fuel air explosive, I guess you'd call it, that you can booby-trap roads and things for it. And they were getting ready with these to fight off a German landing on, when they came up the road to attack England. Churchill's "we'll fight on the fields and we'll fight in the beaches and streets" and blah, blah, blah. And I looked quite hard. You won't find much at all written about the use of fougasses in World War I. But, oh yes, that's right, as I was looking around, I found this fascinating story, very, very contemporary, from the current Ukraine war. And this story read, "National Guardsmen and military counterintelligence have discovered a mine corridor containing MON-90s, MON-50s, fougasses, and OZM-72 mines in Kharkiv Oblast." This was as the Ukrainians were liberating Kharkiv just last year. And you can see the caption the editor had to put in because they just assumed nobody will know what the heck is a fougasse. And so improvised mortars constructed by making a hollow in the ground or rock and filling it with explosives and projectiles. Apparently the Russians were using them and setting up booby traps in Kharkiv as the Ukrainians were moving in. And I did find on the Imperial War Museum website a photo of a Bangalore torpedo, and here's their description. The Bangalore torpedo was an explosive charge fixed on the end of a long tube, to which could be attached additional lengths to extend it so that it could be pushed across the ground to clear obstacles without endangering the operative. In particular, they were used to clear paths through barbed wire and entanglements. The original Bangalore torpedo was invented in 1912 by a British Army officer, Captain McClintock, of the Bengal, Bombay and Madras sappers and miners at Bangalore, India, as a means of exploding booby traps and barricades left over from the Boer and Russo-Japanese wars. The torpedo consisted of a number of externally identical lengths of threaded pipe, one of which contained the explosive charge. The pipes would be screwed together using connecting sleeves to make a longer pipe of the required length, and a smooth nose cone would be screwed on the end to prevent snagging on the ground. It would then be pushed forward from a protected position and detonated to clear a path through barbed wire. Similar devices are still in service today. And I found a couple of passing references as I dug deeper that they weren't used at the Battle of Cambrai, but they were used elsewhere near Cambrai as a distraction to make the Germans think perhaps they were not attacking in the place they were really attacking. Now, I strongly suspect that the story I'm telling you today that relates to my great-uncle is actually what they're referring to, but sadly they don't spell out the details, but you'll see soon enough what I'm talking about. Oh yeah, and if you have seen Bangalores, the most commonplace people will be aware of them is in the movie Saving Private Ryan. You see, there's Tom Hanks, they're stuck on the beaches, and there's these big sandbanks, and they use some Bangalore torpedoes to clear a hole so they can actually storm the German bunkers. And if you go back and watch an older D-Day movie, The Longest Day, you'll also see them using Bangalore torpedoes. And they are still in use today. I mean, if you can get something under barbed wire to clear a hole for the troops to charge through, so much the better. So here we have US Marines practicing with it. And they called it here during a demolition training range in Southwest Asia in 2016. I always find Southwest Asia an interesting expression because it's not a term that anybody really except academics tend to use. Southwest Asia means the Middle East. I'm kind of curious why they chose to use that term. Maybe they wanted to avoid saying the Middle East, I don't know. Now, back to the story. The Field Company's War Diary describes the process. Officer Commanding having proposed to the 17th Infantry Brigade that fougasses should be laid in Somerville Wood, an experiment was tried using a small charge of gunpowder and a hole bored with an 8-inch earth auger. Results good. Further experiments to be tried when more gunpowder available. So you can see here on the map on the left there's Dragoon Post, and I've already pointed out Somerville Wood just a little bit down to the right from it. Now, I walked around on Google Maps, Street View, trying to get as close as I could, and there was a street where the truck obviously got to a certain point and stopped and turned back, but this was the closest I could get, looking in the direction, and you can see this thin bit of wood right in the middle of the photo. That is Somerville Wood, so I guess it was kind of behind there, fairly close to the front line, somewhere where they could not be seen by the Germans and they could do a bit of a demonstration on how to use fougasses and possibly also the Bangalore torpedoes. On the 3rd of November, there were further experiments with fougasses using Mills grenades with a device for releasing strike on explosion. So basically you stick a Mills bomb in a hole with a charge on the bottom and then attached to a fuse of some description. You set off the charge and the grenade pops up into the sky and goes off like a like one of those jumping landmines they use these days. 8th of November, the devices were demonstrated to the Brigadier General commanding 17th Infantry Brigade. And that was another one of these great aristocratic British names, Brigadier General Walter Robert Butler Doran. And he, wasn't a young man, but what do you expect of a Brigadier General in World War I? Now this photo, as you can see, was taken in 1893, so he would have been considerably older when he visited them. And it's also interesting how many of these British officers serving in World War I were actually products of the British Empire. So many of them either saw service in India or even as far afield as China, and many of them indeed had actually been born over there. So this guy was actually born in Lahore in India. And, I just like random details you find about people when you research them. And his mother's name also struck me as kind of funny, Georgina Sultana McGrath. Now, how on earth did she end up with the middle name Sultana? I will never know. And the other minor detail was he might have been a member of the English upper class, but his probate documents showed he only left £470 to his wife, which was rather pathetic. It's one of the smallest amounts I've ever seen on one of these probates. So he probably didn't manage his money very well, shall we say. And this is a complete digression, but it was so interesting I had to stick it in. He had one son, and when I was researching him, I came across his name, John Desmond Beauchamp Doran. Even better name. Apparently everybody called him Desmond. And he, as I said, he only had one child, and he was in the SAS, the Secret Intelligence Service, and the Intelligence Corps in World War II, and he died at age 33 in 1946 when he was the victim of a targeted Zionist terrorist attack. The Stern Gang went after him because he was in a position where he would have been hunting them, and it was said he was on the upstairs balcony with his wife when they attacked, and one of the stories at least says he engaged them, but he was killed by bombs, and that was his house. The downstairs was an office of the British administration, so that's a whole other story. And in a future episode, one of the second lieutenants who was with my great-uncle when he was killed on the Crozat Canal also ended up being killed in 1946 during the Zionist uprising, and we will get to that in another episode. Now, November the 11th, exactly 1 year short of when World War I would end. Of course, they wouldn't know it at the time. Officer commanding discussed the question of the use of fougasses in an offensive operation with the brigade major of the 17th Infantry Brigade and the officers in command of the 3rd Rifle Brigade and the 12th Royal Fusiliers, the 12th Royal Fusiliers being my great-uncle's battalion. So let's actually go out in no man's land and actually use these things. And in the meantime, let's play some soccer. So, recreational training. The company beat the 103rd Field Company at football. I guess the 104th Field Engineers were pretty good soccer players. Now, the 12th of November, Brigadier General commanding 17th Infantry Brigade told the officer commanding that a demonstration with fougasses and bangalore torpedoes would be required at an early date. Okay, let's see what you can do. Second Lieutenant Horrocks of the Royal Engineers went out with the 12th Royal Fusiliers Fighting Patrol to reconnoitre Square Copse, G33A94, which I've put on the map for you. But patrol did not reach its destination. Now, I've already mentioned 11 Trees and Square Copse featuring heavily later on, so remember these locations. And remember also those red lines are the German trenches. 13th of November, Officer Commanding and Lieutenant Watson and one NCO accompanied fighting patrol of 1st Royal Fusiliers to Big Bill and selected a site for digging in fougasses on a date to be notified later. So there's Big Bill, I should say. It's another one of these interesting rectangular forest strips a little bit further north of Dragoon Post. And on the 17th of November, Officer Commanding and 2nd Lieutenant Horrocks of the Royal Engineers accompanied fighting patrol of 3rd Rifle Brigade to inspect ground on which bangalore torpedoes and improvised mortars are to be let off on a day to be notified later. Now, from context and what was going to happen later, they were back to Square Copse, the place where they had failed to reach earlier on. So these are the two places where they're going to have a go using these bangalore torpedoes and fougasses. On the 19th of November, 7 p.m., Lieutenant Watson of the Royal Engineers with 15 other ranks just meaning, privates and maybe a few NCOs, regular grunts. Lieutenant Watson, Royal Engineers, with 15 ordinary ranks from the Royal Engineers and 15 ordinary ranks from the 1st Royal Fusiliers, moved into La Verguière to carry out operation on Appendix A attached. So this area in this oval I put on the map, that is going to be the area of operations that I showed you on the previous slide. And there is the staging point that they're using for it, for the most northerly part of the operation. And 2nd Lieutenant Horrocks of the Royal Engineers with 6 other ranks of the Royal Engineers and 25 other ranks of the 12th Royal Fusiliers moved up to Vadencourt to carry out Operation A on Appendix X attached. Now this confused the heck out of me because I got up my Google Maps and I looked up Vadencourt and it was deep behind German lines. So I thought that can't possibly be right. And it took me a while, and thanks again to Google Maps, to realize that it was a spelling mistake. It wasn't V-A-D-E-N, should have been V-A-D-A-N, and nowhere on this trench map does it use that name, but when you zoom in and out on Google Maps, you can see down the bottom there is a chateau, and Google Maps describes it as Domaine de Vadencourt, and that makes much more sense than saying they were staging out of a village behind German lines. So thank goodness for Google Maps. Now, the 17th Infantry Brigade Operation Order number 207. This is the appendix they were referring to. Now, I'm not going to bore you by reading it all out. I'll just cover some of the critical stuff. The following minor operations, A and B, will be carried out by the 17th Infantry Brigade on a date to be notified later, Z Day. A. 6 bangalore torpedoes and 4 bomb throwers will be discharged in vicinity of Square Copse. B. 12 fougasses will be exploded in the valley about G20, I'll show you where that is in a moment, to take effect on the enemy post at G20D 40.40. and there's a whole bunch of descriptions here. For my purposes, I'm always interested in where my great uncle might have been. So you can see here, Operation A. The 12th Royal Fusiliers will provide a carrying party of 1 sergeant and 25 other ranks. Well, that's all of them. Remember we mentioned earlier that it was 1 officer and 25 other ranks? Interestingly, no mention of an officer. Where's my great uncle? These will report to the 104th Field Company Royal Engineers at Milieu Copse, etc., etc., and then they will advance, getting ready for Y/Z night and all of the rest. And then there's also organisational stuff about the machine gunners. There will be the 17th Machine Gun Company will be divided into 3 groups with main targets, and I'll talk more about that, exactly how the machine guns were going to cover them. It's actually fascinating to look through all these appendixes because you can reconstruct exactly how you do a trench raid and how they tried to cover everything to protect them and, well, make it work. So, each group to include sappers carrying what are described in the war diary as cable drivers and exploders. Well, I guess the exploders will be like those plunging things like my Muppets bomber guy uses, and I can only assume cable drivers. I looked it up, I couldn't actually find a decent description of what a World War I cable driver was. When I googled it, I mostly got stuff about computer drivers. But anyway, I assume this is for, attaching cables to the charges to set them off from a safe distance. Now, Big Bill, Group B, has their rally point right there. So they're going to go crawling up through no man's land as close as they can get to the German front line, and Big Bill will be their staging point in no man's land. They'll go up there and then they'll do whatever they're going to do, then they'll come back to Big Bill. Now, in the war diary, it describes them putting the fougasses in approximately that position using their map coordinates, and saying that that's the point you would get those grenades to pop up and explode over that German roadway, and, just might... When you go set off the Bangalore torpedoes, maybe the German infantry will respond and rush to the area because, it looks like a breakthrough's happening if they've just cleared the barbed wire, and so we'll have a bunch of grenades fly through the sky and go off above their heads. Now, 11 trees down the bottom, which I already told you to take note of, is where Group A will rally. And again, it doesn't say precisely in this case where they'll put the fougasses, but somewhere in that general direction, and Square Copse was clearly their target. And then, after they have laid the charges and the Bangalore torpedoes, they will withdraw, and in each of these rally points, they will leave 1 sapper and 1 scout with the detonators who will fire the fougasses at 0 hour. That's how the plan's going to work. Now, let me tell you about the machine guns. First off, most people have a incorrect understanding of how machine guns were used in World War I. I mean, everybody knows, like you see in this picture, there's machine guns in the trenches and the enemy are charging and you're mowing them down. In fact, most machine guns were not deployed in the trenches. They had light machine guns like Lewis guns, but these tripod-mounted heavy Vickers were usually actually dug in away from the trenches. Like they'd have, for example, a front-line trench and a second-line trench, and they would dig and camouflage a separate dugout between the trench lines. And the thing that I really didn't appreciate until I started researching my New Zealand grandfather in the New Zealand Machine Gun Battalion was just how often they would fire ballistically like light artillery. So they wouldn't be firing straight ahead at enemy infantry attacking them. Get that out of your head. The vast majority of rounds fired by British machine guns in World War I were fired ballistically. You shoot upwards, they go out, and then they rain down. And they distribute more widely, and they have a considerably longer range. And also, for men hiding in trenches, well, if the bullets have a bit of a downwards trajectory as they're approaching the German trenches, it's going to make the trenches considerably more unhealthy than just firing across the top of them. And it was actually really hard to find a picture of a heavy machine gun being aimed upwards. I found a few that were, obviously anti-aircraft being pointed straight up, but finding one at an angle like that was hard to find. So I managed to find these Australians. I think they're even in World War II, but at least you've got a better sense of the angle that the machine guns would often be pointing at when they're opening fire. And just to reinforce this, I've quoted this guy before, Brigadier General Lionel de Vere, Sadleir-Jackson. Don't you love those names? He was the Brigadier General in charge of the 54th Brigade. The reason I'm interested in him particularly was because my great-uncle's battalion, the 11th Fusiliers, notice not the 12th, he changed battalions, but when he was in the 11th, that battalion was part of the 54th Brigade, and they got annihilated, and this guy, Lionel de Vere, Sadleir-Jackson, was an angry, angry man, and he was perfectly prepared to lay blame on all and sundry. In fact, blame pretty much everybody for the military disaster except himself, and he in particular targeted the British machine gunners, and this gives you a strong impression of what I was talking about. Lessons learned from the operations on March 21st, April 7th, 1918. The absolute failure of the machine gun battalions. With scarcely an exception, the support given to the infantry of the 54th Brigade, either in attack or defence, by the 18th Machine Gun Battalion has been negligible. The guns, under the command of 2nd Lieutenant Cooper, fought well on the Crozet Canal until this officer was killed, so he'll mention one guy did a good job, all the rest were useless. The tactical handling of the guns must be under the orders of the Brigadier. The recent experience has shown that the correct tactical handling of machine guns in battle is a closed book to most machine gun officers and NCOs. Furthermore, machine guns will not in most cases fight with the infantry, and it is extremely difficult to get a machine gun team to take a position where they can fire direct over the sights. Experiences prove that machine guns, even with an officer, will not occupy forward positions with the infantry. It is understood that many machine gun officers possess no knowledge of machine gun tactics, but there appears no reason why they should not obey orders, like I ordered them to get up front with my infantry and they just ignored me. Battalion commanders have reported that machine guns, even placed by them, will not remain in a forward position from where they can fight their guns. Indirect fire at 2,000 or 3,000 yards appears to be the only class of work they're prepared to undertake. So yes, it's in the guise of strong criticism and saying how useless they are, but it also gives you a strong sense of the kind of duty they were performing. There might be a reason why the machine gunners were reluctant to get at the front, because which ones do you want to kill first? If you're the enemy, you always want to take out the enemy machine gunners. They didn't call them the Suicide Squad for nothing, and yes, that's what they were called long before that Marvel movie Suicide Squad came out. So machine gunners perhaps had some good reasons for not wanting to get right up at the front. Now, the instructions for the machine gunners are absolutely fascinating. 12 guns will be employed in 3 groups, each group consisting of 4 guns. An officer will be in command of each group. Small arms ammunition dumps will be formed in vicinity of the guns, and 12,000 rounds of small arms ammunition will be provided for each guns. 12 guns with 12,000 bullets each. Now, 12 times 12, even I can manage that with my math, that's 144,000 bullets that are going to be fired for this single operation by 12 guns. And when you've got like when the New Zealand machine gunners are going, typically, on a quiet night, they'd say shoot 4,000 rounds. If something was going on, 12,000, 14,000 rounds being shot by 12 guns would have been, an active night. Now, I'm not going to read all this out to you, but if you want all the exact details and all the coordinates and all of the rest, you can pause the YouTube and watch it. But I have on this slide taken all of that information and put it into a form that, well, makes sense. I spent a long time plotting out exactly where the coordinates were and working out exactly what was going on, so you don't have to. So there's the area of operations. That's where the engineers with their accompanying infantry are going to be sneaking out with the Bangalore torpedoes and the fougasses. Now the machine guns of Group A are down not that far from that chateau. You can see down the bottom. Now initially the operation kicks off. All 4 guns were to fire intensively on that position just to the southeast of the area of operations. So have a hail of machine gun bullets fall down in the German trenches, keep their heads down, make sure there are no German reinforcements rushing in from the flanks. Now, after an initial hail of bullets by all 4 machine guns, 2 of them were to remain on that target, and then the other 2 were to traverse back and forth, sort of more widely distributed, but to lay a hail of machine gun bullets that would fall in that general area. So again, you can see here, you're making sure, well in this case it's the German left from looking at from the German point of view, that any troops in that area will be keeping their heads down while the Royal Engineers are sneaking out. Now, the machine guns from Group B will be firing ballistically over the heads. Remember, I already told you, it's always these curve shots. They'll be firing over the head of the area of operation, and they will rain down immediately behind, so that hopefully you won't have any Germans rushing up the support trenches to reinforce that area. And again, 2 of the machine guns will stay on that target, and the other 2 will traverse back and forth in that general area, again trying to close off any German response. So you'll not be surprised to know that the machine gunners of Group C are going to be firing to the north. 2 of them remain on target, and then the other 2 will traverse back and forth, which, when you see it laid out on a map like that, makes absolute sense. This is a way to minimize a German response and to try to make it a bit safer for this trench raid. And, well, as I say, I really found it quite interesting and logical to take all of those map coordinates and plot it all out and just see exactly how they were using these machine gunners to protect it. As I said, these are machine gunners being used as light artillery, not the way you always see them in the movies, just bap, 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 as guys charging across no man's land. And, oh yeah, and you can see Group A is just up a little bit north of the domain de Vadencourt. Now, it also mentions some artillery, not a lot, but a little bit. 2 18-pounders of Battery 106 are available for the operation. One gun will be laid on Filier Redoubt, and the other one, Boisson Galaine Farm. FME is firmer. I think that's how you pronounce it, French for farm. Now, I couldn't find a decent photo that I liked for an 18-pounder from France. This is clearly from the Middle East, you can tell from the helmets, but it is a British 18-pounder. And so this is the kind of gun they would have had in support. These guns will only fire at the wish of the right and left battalion commanders when the following code words will be wired to right group headquarters. Now, in the war diary, it never makes a mention again of using the artillery, so it may be that they just decided not to use them. I think I mentioned in a previous episode, if you fire artillery at the enemy, they tend to retaliate by firing artillery back, so they may have just decided not to court trouble, so they may not have used them, I don't know. But the code words, well, they're not very imaginative. The code word for firing on Filier Redoubt was Filier. And guess what the code word for fighting on Boisson Galaine was? Well, it was Boisson. They were, I guess, running out of imaginative ideas. So not exactly code words, but that's what they used. A certain number of French guns may also become available. Details will be issued later to all concerned. Be kind of interested to know how that happened. You know, cooperation between the British and the French was not always that great. Code words, as under, will be wired to brigade headquarters by units concerned and will denote that the covering party has returned and that the necessary explosives, etc., have been installed successfully. The 3rd Rifle Brigade, their code word will be PIP. And you can probably guess at this point what the code word for the other ones, the 8 Buffs, their code word will be Squeak. Yes, Pip and Squeak. I think they really needed to get a bit more imaginative, but never mind. And these are the 2 places where the artillery were told to shoot at, which again makes sense. They're very close to where these guys would have been sneaking up with their Bangalore torpedoes, so I guess it makes sense. Did they ever actually shoot? I do not know. Now, what about my great-uncle, the whole reason I started researching this particular trench raid? Well, what was 2nd Lieutenant William Francis of the 12th Royal Fusiliers doing? Was he involved in these trench raids? Well, it mentions that they used all of the ordinary ranks from the Royal Fusiliers. He was sent 1 officer and 25 men were sent, and all 25 men were used. So one possibility is it's just assumed that their officer would have tagged along on the raid, and of course he was there, and that's why he didn't need a mention. The other possibility is that they were doing exactly the same thing that I suspect the 12th Fusiliers were doing. They were taking a young, inexperienced officer who they didn't necessarily trust or didn't want to end up, getting himself killed because he was too green, and they told him, you just sit this one out. So maybe he just sat back in the dugouts and didn't do anything while he read a newspaper while the rest of his men went off. Sad to say, there's no way of telling. Now, that was all the plan for the raid. It sounds wonderful. It sounds carefully plotted out with the artillery and the machine gun support and those staging points and all of the rest. And of course, no battle plan survives contact with the enemy. And I found in my historical research in the past, looking up these maxims to find out where they come from often makes interesting reading. So I thought, I wonder where that saying originally comes from. And I looked it up online, and I found that this quote was said by General MacArthur, General Patton, von Clausewitz, it was said by Colin Powell, it was said by Helmut von Moltke the Younger, and Helmut von Moltke the Elder. And that brings me back to Confucius said, never trust anything you read on the internet. And Abraham Lincoln said, don't believe everything you read on the internet just because there's a picture with a quote next to it. So who actually said it? That required a bit more digging, and it was in fact Helmut von Moltke the Elder. The von Moltke who was involved in World War I was the younger. This guy was more of a 19th century Prussian military expert. And then I thought, well, he spoke terribly good English, didn't he? Why did he say it in English? Well, of course he didn't say it in English. So I went digging further to find out what he actually said. And he said, kein Operationsplan reicht mit einiger Sicherheit über das erste Zusammentreffen mit der feindlichen Hauptmacht hinaus. And what does that mean? Well, it doesn't actually mean exactly what the English makes it sound like. It translates as, no plan of operation extends with any certainty beyond the first encounter with the main enemy force. Well, it's a lot more nuanced, and it doesn't say that the battle plan won't survive. It just, your planning can't extend with any certainty beyond it. You need to be ready for changes and flexibility. So, I mean, I can see why they don't use that one as their quote on all of these silly posters, because, well, it's not as pithy, but it's also, as I said, a lot more nuanced. So, how did the operation actually work out, though, when they actually went out? So, on November the 20th, Z-Day, as they were calling it. So, 12 midnight. That's midnight of the night of the 19th/20th. Parties started from our lines. 20th at 4:30 a.m. Report received from 2nd Lieutenant Horrocks that all charges successfully laid. One private from the 12th Battalion Royal Fusiliers killed by a trench mortar. But how about the other group? That was Group A. Group B. 6 a.m. Lieutenant Watson report that a hostile patrol of about 40 strong had passed through the covering party of the 8th Battalion, the Buffs, and attacked his working party. Well, they weren't a very good covering party, were they? The whole point was for them to stop them getting flanked. After a firefight, he'd been able to connect up 6 fougasses, but owing to continued presence of the enemy, had been obliged to fire them at 5:25 a.m. instead of waiting for 0 hour. Casualties nil. So I guess, they were used to having British patrols in no man's land. The Germans would send out patrols into no man's land. They encountered each other. Well, there were no casualties, so it wasn't that stiff a fight, but it did rather spoil the plans for what Group B was doing in the northern part of the operation. 6:20 a.m., 0 hour. 4 Bangalore torpedoes successfully fired in wire at Square Copse, also junction close. The handwriting was poor there. I think it was the word close. To fire 4 improvised mortars at 2-minute intervals, starting at 0 and 2 minutes. And I found this wonderful picture of some troops using Bangalore torpedoes to clear barbed wire. It was the best photo I could find, but yes, I know they're Germans. So I played around and look, I fixed it. They're not Germans anymore, they're British troops. They've got the right helmets on now. Now there's something else I want you to notice. 0 hour for this little operation was at 6:20 a.m. Now, was anything else going on at 6:20 a.m. on November the 20th, 1917? Remember earlier in this episode I mentioned the Battle of Cambrai, the first mass deployment of tanks that got a massive breakthrough on the German lines? Yes, that is 0 hour for the kickoff of the huge German assault against Cambrai. So, well, they were saying about distractions of using Bangalore torpedoes. There is nothing in the documentation that I found describing what these Royal Engineers were getting up to that mentions anything about them being a distraction or trying to draw the Germans' attention to them. As far as they're concerned, they're just trying out some new ideas. They're trying out fougasses. They're trying out these Bangalore torpedoes. But I think the higher-ups probably just didn't tell them, but thought, yes, I think it's a good idea, but why don't you do it on the night of the 19th/20th of November, and let us suggest that 0 hour should be exactly 6:20 a.m. Just do it as we want. That's what I suspect was going on. Now, let's carry on to see what happened later on. In December, the 5th of December, 1:20 p.m, the officer commanding, while visiting the 17th Infantry Brigade, was informed that another demonstration was made on the 20th that's the 20th of last month. No, that was the one we've already talked about. Was to be made, and they wanted another one to be made on the night of the 6th and 7th of December. And, well, they said it was impossible as preparations could not be made in time and fougasses could not be dug as the ground was frozen. I've read elsewhere that it was a particularly brutal winter, the winter of 1917-1918, really unusually cold. So the ground was frozen, so you couldn't effectively dig these holes you needed for these improvised mortars. But they promised to explode 4 bangalores and wire at Square Copse and fire 4 improvised mortars from Big Hill. 6 p.m. on the 6th, Lieutenant Watson of the Royal Engineers took 3 ordinary ranks of the Royal Engineers and another 12 ordinary ranks from the 1st Royal Fusiliers and moved off to Graham's Post and placed 4 improvised mortars in positions in northeast corner of Big Bill. We've seen that on the map already, and returned without being interfered with. 8:30 p.m. 2nd Lieutenant Horrocks, with 3 of his ordinary ranks and another 12th from the Royal Fusiliers, again, is my great-uncle there, who can say, and they moved off from Lone Tree Post and placed 4 bangalore torpedoes in the wire at Square Copse without being interfered with. So they did it at least one more time. I guess if you have guys going out regularly blowing holes in your barbed wire, it may make the Germans think they need a few more troops in that area because, well, when are the British going to attack in force? On the 7th of December at 12:30 p.m, bangalores and mortars successfully fired. And, well, that was the end of those experiments as far as I know. But my great-uncle was still with them, so Christmas of 1917, what did they do? They played soccer. Officers played a soccer match against the NCOs and tied 3-3. Then the married men played the single men and won 6-0. And on December the 27th, Captain H.G. Francis assumed temporary command of the 104th Field Company Royal Engineers. Now, why does that matter to me? Because my great-uncle was called William Francis, and when I saw his name appearing in the war diaries, I immediately thought, aha, I've got it. Is that why he was sent across to the engineers? Was Captain Francis, some kind of cousin of his? Was he trying to, bring him under his command to protect him and, look after him or train him up so he'd survive the war? And I looked and looked through all of my family tree, and it was a false clue. There was no relationship that I can establish between Captain Francis and Second Lieutenant William Francis, my relative. It was just this weird coincidence that, they happen to have the same last name. And on January the 13th, 1918, attached 8th Buffs and 12th Royal Fusiliers returned to their units in the afternoon. Now, they never again mention their officer who came with them. Now, the officer, as I know from his military file, was my great-uncle William Francis, so you assume that when they sent all the ordinary ranks back, they would have sent the officer as well, and that may therefore suggest that they were also assuming that he went along with them when they were doing these trench raids in the middle of November. I don't know. But the interesting thing here is, where did they go? Because you couldn't send them back to the 12th Royal Fusiliers because the 12th Royal Fusiliers didn't exist. The British Army, and especially the 5th Army that was covering the south, was suffering a massive manpower shortage, and they made the uncomfortable decision to disband a whole bunch of battalions and redistribute all of their men to other battalions. So by the time he had finished his attachment with the Royal Engineers, he arrived in August of 1917, joining the 12th Battalion. September he sent to the Royal Engineers. When the end of January comes along, and he goes, okay, back to your battalion, but what battalion? The 12th Royal Fusiliers doesn't exist anymore. Where am I supposed to go? Well, it obviously took a little bit of time to sort it out, and eventually he was redeployed to the 11th Battalion, and that's where he would die on the Crozat Canal. But I'll probably make a whole episode about what was going on with all these disbandments and reorganizations on another occasion. Now, the final note to this episode is Captain Hugh Gordon Francis. And again, I mentioned a lot of these guys seem to be born in India. Now, he was born in Dhaka, that is described as Eastern Bengal. Now, it's not called that anymore. It's called Bangladesh. It's a whole independent country, but at the time it was all part of the British Raj. And there's a weird coincidence, aside from the fact that he had the same last name as my great-uncle, because he was destined to die in the same battle as my great-uncle, and he is commemorated on the Fusiliers Memorial in the same place that you'll find my uncle's name, because his body was also never found. There's thousands of men on this memorial, and you can see his name there, down on the bottom left, Captain Francis, HG, Military Cross. The MC stands for Military Cross. And elsewhere on the same memorial, you'll find William Francis, my great-uncle. And here we have it. A list of men who were killed during there, and you don't have to look far to find both names. So on the top, Captain Hugh Gordon Francis, Military Cross of the 104th Field Company Royal Engineers, mentioned in dispatches, killed in action at La Vigueur, 22nd March 1918, age 30. And then under Lance Corporal Francis, you find Second Lieutenant William Joseph Francis, my grandmother's brother of the 11th Battalion Royal Fusiliers, 22nd of March 1918. Now that's actually a mistake, and later on, as you dig through my great-uncle's military file, they changed their mind. Initially, they ruled that he was killed on the 22nd. Later, they changed their mind and ruled that he was killed on the 23rd. But for the purposes of this documentation and how they're commemorated, they're listed as having died on the same day. And even if it was a day apart, it's still a rather uncomfortable coincidence that both men were destined to die in the same battle at almost the same time. And that's all I have for you today about these combat engineers. And I found this photo on the right. He was just a mascot who was aboard one of the New Zealand transport ships that went out in October of 1914. I made several episodes featuring that voyage, and I just thought he was cute and wanted to stick it in. Really nothing to do with this episode, but as I was searching through the New Zealand Army, the National Army Museum of New Zealand, looking for photos for this episode, I stumbled across that one and thought, well, I've got to find an excuse to use it somewhere, so there it is. There's a dog. And on that note, I'm going to say good evening to you.